Dip pens or fine liners? Which one of these two are best for inking? Well, today we're going to find out the answer to that. And if you guys are not familiar with the terms, then fine liners are these pens which come in lots of different sizes. And basically they have fine tips which produce consistent lines. And these are ideal for architectural drawings, like these Unipin dip fine liners, which I like to use. There are lots of brands such as Pigment Micron and many others. But basically you get very fine lines with these pens. As you can see, it doesn't really matter what angle I hold the pen at or how much pressure I apply. I get the same thickness of line and basically no line variation. So if you want really consistent lines in your artwork, these can be very good. Especially for stuff like hatching, which is a shading technique in inking, where you draw parallel lines one after the other to create the illusion of a shade. And finer tip pens are actually better for hatching, whereas the more thicker tips are used for line work, such as drawing outlines of different characters. Whereas dip pens are these really sharp old school pens which you need to dip into ink repeatedly, but the plus point here is that you get insane line variation with dip pens because they have a flexible tip, which means the more pressure you apply, the thicker your lines get. It's almost hard to believe when you use a dip pen for the first time that this line and the one right next to it are just drawn with the same pen. It kind of feels like magic. And so it's really satisfying to draw with dip pens. And they're also very good for lots of line variation. Not to mention the very soothing scratching noises that dip pens make, which is why I always like to ink using dip pens, because fine liners I feel are just kind of boring in comparison. Of course, you can do everything that you can do with a fine liner using a dip pen, such as hatching, but you need to be a bit careful about how much pressure you apply, because if you apply too much pressure, then it can just ruin your illustration. Whereas with fine liners, you don't need to worry about that. There are lots of different kinds of nibs for dip pens. This is the G pen nib, which is used mostly for drawing manga artwork or manga characters. And most of these dip pens are actually used in Japanese calligraphy and Japanese drawing industry, such as drawing manga and anime artworks. However, I will give these the pro tag because dip pens really have a bit of a higher learning curve, because to create good illustrations with a dip pen, you need to practice a lot, and you won't be able to just draw with a dip pen for the very first time and be able to get even a decent looking drawing with it. So now let's just compare the two by drawing something. So for this comparison, I'm going to draw an illustration of Naruto using both of these pens, and I'm not really using any pencil lines underneath because, well, I can mostly accurately draw one illustration like 2 times without using any sort of pencil guidelines. However, that does mean that the proportions are not going to be that accurate. But we are more concerned about line quality here. So, as you can see, when you're drawing with a dip pen, a slight variation in pressure is enough to create a much thicker line, which is why these are not ideal for beginners. So if you're just starting out and it's like your very first time learning how to ink drawings or how to create illustrations with pen and ink, then I would suggest that you should always start out with fine liners, because fine liners are just going to be much easier to control. However, if you have practiced a bit with fine liners, you can always pick up a dip pen and start learning, or just start making basic hand memory of how to hold the pen to get the kind of lines that you want. And you can see that I'm varying the thickness of the lines quite a lot here, which is something you can also do using fine liners. If you just use fine liners of different sizes. But with dip pens, you can just complete the whole illustration with just one pen, which is something I feel is quite amazing. And if productivity is your goal, if you want to finish your illustrations in the least time possible, then it's really ideal to ink using a dip pen, because you're going to get the whole thing done much faster. Of course, given the fact that you are experienced with using the dip pen. There are also lots of choices of nibs when it comes to dip pens. Some of my favorite ones are the Maru nib and the G pen nib, which I'm using in this video. But there are lots of other ones, some of which are more suited towards calligraphy, while others are more suited towards drawing. One thing to keep in mind is that if you have a very circular sort of nib, such as the Maru nib, which is used for like drawing details, it's also called as the mapping nib, then in that case, well, you won't really be able to draw curved lines with it, because you need like a very flat nib in order to draw curved lines. So if you're drawing lots of circles in your illustration, it would be a better idea to choose a flatter nib. The G pen nib is sort of intermediate when it comes to curvature, so you can draw curved lines as well as straight lines with it. But you would really need to experiment with different kinds of nibs, because like there is a huge change in the quality of lines that you would get whenever you change the nibs of a dip pen. Even if it's the G pen nib, getting a G pen nib of a different brand might give you completely different lines. However, that's really not the case at all. With fine liners, it doesn't really matter if you're using Pigment Micron fine liners or Copic multiliners or Unipen fine liners. You would more or less get the same kind of lines. And here I am just inking his headband using the dip pen. And I actually decided to fill in all the black parts of this illustration using a brush pen. So I'm going to hold off to filling in the black areas until the end, when I'm also done with drawing the other illustration right next to it. And now I'm just drawing the same drawing of Naruto using a 0.3 mm fine liner. And you can see right away that every single line I draw with a fine liner looks basically the same. So you can say that your drawings are going to lack some character if you use fine liners. However, it is much easier to draw with fine liners, so I did find myself being like more relaxed when I was using a fine liner. Because when you're drawing with a dip pen, you need to really be focused, and you can't just be absent-minded at all, otherwise the drawing is just going to suck. But when you're inking with a fine liner, you can just zone out, and it doesn't really matter because you basically just have to focus on drawing the lines and not stuff like what angle you're holding the pen at, or is the nib filled with ink or not, or how much pressure you're applying. All these variables are just disappear when you're using a fine liner. So I believe if there are some instances in your drawing when you do not need line variation, or you would actually prefer to draw every single line with the same amount of thickness, then these pens are really ideal for it. I mostly prefer to use fine liners when I'm drawing objects or backgrounds, or whatever thing where I want a sort of a flatter look, because using dip pens really adds a lot of character to the drawing and sort of adds more depth. But when you're using fine liners, the end result can look a bit flat. Well, I did change the proportions quite a bit here if you compare the two drawings, but basically everything that I talked about in the beginning of the video, you can just see in action right now, that how having line variation really drastically improves the quality of your artwork. And yes, you can definitely get line variation using fine liners, but you would have to again use different sizes of pens, so it would really waste a lot more time. And there you have it. After inking these two illustrations using a brush pen, this is the final result, and you can see that the drawing on the left looks really perfect in terms of everything, and the drawing on the right, well, is basically the same, but it does lack a lot of depth. And if you compare the two side by side, maybe you won't be able to tell the difference from a distance, but if you look up close, then yeah, the pens do give more line variation. And yeah, basically that was the whole comparison. I hope you guys liked the video. If you did, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to my channel. And if you'd like to see more of my content, then be sure to check out this video next.